Hello, welcome to The Week. Today we have with us a special guest, renowned art historian and award-winning writer Mr. William Dalrymple. His latest book, The Golden Road, gives a brilliant account of ancient India's contributions in reshaping the world. Thank you, sir. It's an honor to have you with
Thank you
us.
for coming and being interviewed in this gorgeous setting of the Taj Malabar, one of my favorite hotels. Great pleasure to be back in Cochin.
So I hear this book was born during the COVID lockdown, but the idea popped up when you visited Cambodia's Angkor Wat. So can you just take us through the process?
So this idea has been sort of an egg I've been sort of clucking over for a long time. Um, 10 years ago, I went back to Ajanta for the first time in a long time, and saw that there'd been massive restoration of the earliest frescoes there, dating from about 100 BC in Cave 9 and 10. No one had written it up, and these are actually the oldest Buddhist paintings in the world. And the ASI had done a very good job restoring it, but had told no one about it and just put it on display. So I took 6 months off and began writing in The Guardian and the New York Review of Books and Marg here in India about these extraordinary early murals, which had always been there, but had been covered up for 100 years with dirt and it'd been, I think someone had put varnish on them, which blacked it out. And that got me back into writing about India's ancient history and early past. As a kid growing up, I was always my first interest was ancient history, and that my first visit to London was to go and see the Tutankhamun exhibition on ancient Egypt at the British Museum. I was born in Scotland and never been to England, and begged my parents to take me to the show. And when I first came to India, the sites I was looking at were Ajanta, Ellora, and Sanchi, and the old Tanjore temple, and so on. Um, and I think my younger self would have been very surprised that I ended up spending quite a lot of my life writing about the 18th century and the East India Company, which my younger self would have thought was very late and uninteresting compared to the mysterious past of the ancient world. And it's been lovely actually discovering this whole new world again after 20 years of doing colonial history and late Mughal history. Uh, it was a great release actually, just to be able to go out, and particularly once lockdown was over, and be able to go and travel, and first around India, seeing the ancient sites again, and then going out to Cambodia, to Laos, to Java, and Sri Lanka, and to explore all the places where Indian influence was most dramatically transformative. Um, and I had such a good time researching this. It was one of the most enjoyable books to work on.
So the book's title is a bit intriguing. It talks about the Golden Road, how ancient India transformed the world. So, so this is about India's contributions from 250 BCE to 1200 CE. So was there an idea of India then? Because you also mentioned Chinese scholars Xuanzang describing India as five Indias made up of more than 70 kingdoms. So how evolved was the concept of India then?
So it's very important to see distinction between a political conception, which India was never one unified country ever, even under Ashoka, um, and a very clear cultural and geographical conception of India. And as early as Alexander the Great arriving in Taxila, he asks the sadhus about India, and they say it's bounded by the Ganges on the east, by the Indus on the west, and by the sea to the south. And so I think there's very clear idea about the geography and cultural unity of India, but equally that it was almost always fractured into competing polities. And as you say, Xuanzang is a very good example. He's clear that there is a place on the globe called India, but he's also calls it
So
70
did
countries.
he actually use the word India in his literature?
So I'm not entirely clear. He wrote in Chinese, so I'm not entirely clear what the Chinese term that he would have used would be, but it's always certainly given in translation as India. I'm not a Chinese speaker, so I can't answer that exact question, I'm afraid. But it is, yeah, it's a famous quotation because he's very clear that he enters India at Jalalabad, and that and that he stays whatever it is 20 years within this area. Now, in that time, he passes many different kingdoms, so he has no claim that there's one political unity. But he's very clear that India is a cultural space that he
So
recognizes.
he identified the whole land as a single entity, at least culturally.
Culturally and religiously, correct. Yeah.
So we'll move on to the trade with Rome. So there is more than enough evidence that a vibrant trade existed between ancient India and Rome. So we have got Roman coins, hordes of Roman coins from Tamil Nadu and Kerala. But the sheer enormity of the trade is mind-boggling. You write about boatloads heading westwards. So this whole thing is beyond our comprehension, right? The amount of trade that happened between these two parts of continents.
Yeah, and this is a fast developing area of scholarly research. I think if you look in old economic history books going back to the 1930s, there's always awareness that there is trade between India and Rome. But I think it's only in the last 2 decades that there's been understanding of the primacy of this trade. That, in fact, Rome was India's biggest trading partner and vice versa. There are several new discoveries which have powered this change. One is the discovery of a manuscript called the Muziris Papyrus, which was found in Egypt, which is just a shipping invoice, but it shows the value of the goods that India was exporting. And this one container talked about in the Muziris Papyrus contained something like 200 tons of ivory, 100 amphorae of black pepper, quantities of nard, which is a highly valuable Himalayan product used in perfumery, and cotton and silk. And together, this container would have allowed the importer, if he actually succeeded in getting it to Alexandria, which we don't know because we just got the invoice, if he did succeed in getting it all the way to Alexandria without pirates or robbers or shipwrecks, he would have become like the Elon Musk of Roman Egypt. That such was the enormous value. The Muziris Papyrus also tells us that the enormous amount taken by the Roman state, 1/3 of the total value of the shipment was there in customs, which must have provided an absolutely massive boost to Roman revenues. So they were very happy with this trade too. But the other thing that's happened is there's been a lot of archaeology, and there's been archaeology here in Kerala and archaeology on the Red Sea coast of Egypt. Here it's been Cherian, PJ Cherian, whose amazing Muziris excavations. I'm going to see again tomorrow. I was a fellow at All Souls in Oxford and during the summer, and PJ came to visit, and I met him there. So first time I've seen him with his excavation, and then if you like, the sister port on the Red Sea coast of Egypt, which is Berenike, which is being dug by a scholar from America, from Chicago, called Steve Sidebottom. And these two archaeological sites between them, with very similar remains, the same sort of amphora, the same sort of Roman glass, the same sort of Indian pepper turning up in both sites, same sort of Indian cotton goods turning up in the same site, has completely changed our view of the importance of this trade. It was clearly a massive trade in both directions. And we've now started getting images of the Buddha turning up in the Isis temple at Berenike. We've had a triad of early Hindu gods. And there's also been another discovery, which is in Socotra, which is an island at the mouth of the Red Sea. And there they found a cave full of Indian graffiti from sea captains going backwards and forwards from India to Egypt. And there are lots and lots of Hindu names, some Syrian Christian names, some Buddhist names, a few prayers, Hindu prayers, and so on, alongside occasional Greek, occasional Roman. But what's striking is how many of the sailors stopping there seem to have been Indian, with Indian names. So we're getting a picture now of a whole world of trade, which has been not ignored because everyone always knew it was there, but certainly it's never had the publicity or the centrality given, say, to the notion of the Silk Road. At this moment in London, there are two big exhibitions in London on the Silk Road. There's the Silk Road show in the British Museum, and there is an oasis on the Silk Road in the British Library. Both those shows have maps which totally ignore India. India is not part of the trading system of antiquity, according to both those shows. But scholarly work now shows that this is completely wrong. That China, that in Roman times, China and Rome had no idea of each
Idea.
other's existence, but there was regular trade with the monsoon winds going backwards and forwards. And you had fleets, according to Strabo, of 250 vessels sailing from the Red Sea ports, often as a single fleet, and arriving 2 months later in Kerala. So it's interesting to sit here and to imagine these Roman ships coming, first sight of the triremes coming down the river towards us. It's very
So
exciting.
even the Chinese goods were moved through the Indian ports, right?
It very specifically says in a book called The Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, which is like the Lonely Planet or the rough guide for Roman traders, that you buy silk in Gujarat. And so I think everyone has come to assume that the Silk Road was a real thing, something that existed in antiquity and is referred to by ancient texts. It's complete nonsense. The term was invented in 1877 by a German geographer called Baron von Richthofen. First entered English in 1936 with Sven Hedin, who's a Swedish Nazi who wrote a travel book. And it's only since the 1980s that this term has gained popularity, and it's overwhelmed the popular conception of travel with sand dunes and camels and the Himalayas. It's all very romantic. But in the early period, it's simply not historically sound.
So this must be some part of this Chinese propaganda, or
Well, the Chinese have
or a
certainly,
political
yeah.
figment of their political
Well, I
foreign
think
policy.
it's lots of things. I think it's partly that it's a romantic idea. So you've always had the Silk Road Cafe, and if you've got a museum exhibition, Silk Road sounds a lot more sexy than Middle East Economic Corridor. You would never use that as a title. But yes, the Chinese have weaponized it, and the Belt and Road is built on the nation of the Silk Road. And the Silk Road certainly exists in the later Middle Ages, when the Mongols smash a hole through Asia and destroy all the kingdoms on the way. They create a single area within the Mongol realm, which you can travel very easily across. So Marco Polo does that in 1271. But that did not exist in the Roman period. It did not exist in ancient times. The big trading partner of Rome was here, particularly Maziris, where we're sitting. I mean, you can literally imagine these Roman vessels as we sit here in the twilight. You can imagine these Roman vessels coming with their pots of gold, trying to buy black
Ivory,
pepper,
yeah,
ivory, circus animals for the
even
Colosseum.
even the elephants.
Elephants and tigers, yeah.
So we'll have to say that Buddhism is probably India's biggest export.
At this period,
Yes.
definitely.
So by the first century, the monks were moving to Central Asia and China. So were they taking Indian ideas beyond the religion with them?
Very much so. With Buddhism travels Prakrit, Sanskrit, and therefore the whole of Indian literature. With them comes Indian ideas of karma and Indian ideas of time, yugas, and so on. Indian ideas of reincarnation, Indian ideas of geography, conceptions like Jambudvipa. All this is inherent in the package of Buddhist literature, which travels with the Buddhist monks. And it doesn't just go to China and to Tibet, it goes to Laos, Cambodia, Burma, Thailand, Sri Lanka, Japan, Korea, Mongolia, Siberia. It's the whole of Asia gets Buddhism. And I think it's partly because there aren't so few Buddhists in India today that no one's really got a stake in claiming, bigging up the importance of Buddhism. But it was an incredibly important export. So was Hinduism. And so, parallel with that, and at the same time as that, you've got this growth of Sanskrit literature.
All this
And
along the 6th century. See.
no, well, so there are maritime contacts with India, both east and west, from at least 1000 BC. The trade with Rome, which we were talking about, heats up when Rome conquers Egypt, which is at the Battle of Actium, Antony Cleopatra, all that sort of stuff. When Octavius Caesar absorbs Egypt into the Roman Empire, that's when India has a sea border with Rome. And it takes only 2 months to travel between the two. What happens with Southeast Asia although there are ancient links between the two, the trade between the east coast of India and Southeast Asia enormously accelerates after the fall of Rome, because India's got used to gold pouring into its coffers thanks to the ivory, thanks to the pepper, thanks to the cotton and the silk. And then Rome falls in the 5th century. The Alaric sacks Rome, Attila sacks Rome, the Goths cross the Rhine, Huns pour through Anatolia, the Vandals pass through Spain. It's complete chaos. And suddenly there are no trading vessels. Your triremes are no longer turning up every autumn, or every spring, rather. And there's a major economic crisis in India, and what happens is that the Tamil trading guilds and the trading guilds of the south in general pivot eastwards, and that's when you start find talk in the Jataka tales and in also the Ramayana and so on of Savarnabhumi, the lands of gold to the east. And in the Ramayana, Sugriva tells Hanuman, you've only got to kick the ground and gold will appear in Savarnabhumi. There's talk of Savarnadvipa, the island of gold. And all this is, we see archaeologically in inscriptions by Tamil trading guilds in places like Malaysia and Thailand, in the Mekong Delta, but also in Sumatra and Borneo. So these guys are really pioneering a new route and to new sources of gold, because the old ones have dried up. From the 5th and 6th century. And with them, you have the arrival of the first Brahmins, and then you get the renaming of the landscape, and suddenly a new Kurukshetra appears in Laos, a new Ayodhya outside Bangkok. Suddenly all the kings are called Suryavarman or Mahendravarman or whatever the name is. And Sanskrit becomes the language of diplomacy and courtly refinement, all the way from Kandahar to Bali. And it's an extraordinary period. So it's very important to emphasize this is not a book of Indian history. This is a book of the diffusion of Indian ideas out of India. And the third topic I talk about is mathematics and astronomy, which also goes in both directions. We have the oldest zero in the world from Cambodia, but its most dramatic diffusion is to the west. And major figures that I talk about in this book are the Burma kids, who are originally known as Pramukh. That's a Sanskrit name they have, and they are the hereditary abbots of the monastery of Naubahar in Balkh in Afghanistan. They convert to Islam at the arrival of Islam. They eventually made viziers of Baghdad, and for 4 generations, they're the all-powerful viziers of the Abbasids. And they send to India, to Ujjain and to Sindh, for the works of Brahmagupta and Aryabhatta. We know exactly the day it arrives in 776.
So it is from them that the Indian mathematics goes towards the
Correct.
west.
So it starts in Baghdad. The most successful translation, because both Brahmagupta and Aryabhatta are very complex, and they're written in poetry rather than in simple prose. And you need a whole education to understand them, and the commentaries that are written unraveling their complexities. So the initial Arabic translations do not seem to have been enormously successful until this guy Al-Khwarizmi turns up, and he's from Khwarazm, which is near Uzbekistan today. It's in Khiva, and he has the necessary linguistic skills to unravel these texts. And he manages to unravel them so successfully that his text can be read by any teenager in the Arab world with great ease, and it's used as an educational tool from Spain to Baghdad, or to the borders of Sindh. And he doesn't hide the Indian origin. He calls it the book of calculation and balancing according to the Hindu method. And that's too long for everyday use. Everyone knows it by nickname, algebra, which is our word, algebra. And his own name, Al-Khwarizmi, is the basis of our word, algorithm.
Algorithm.
And then this gets translated into Italian by none other than Fibonacci. Fibonacci takes it to Italy, and Fibonacci's text is later, a version of Fibonacci's text reaches the Renaissance painter Piero della Francesca, who then takes it, or rather his friend, a friar called Luca Caroli, takes it to Milan, where he shows it to his flatmate, who is Leonardo da Vinci. So all these extraordinary connections take
So
place.
Fibonacci was aware that the text he had with him had its origins in India, right?
Completely aware,
He
and says
mentions
it, and,
that.
and not, says it absolutely up front on the opening page. He says this is the modus Indorum, the method of the Indians, and it involves the 9 figures of the Indias. He calls it plus 0, and he says with the 9 figures of the India plus 0, you can express any number up to infinity. And so he's dazzled by this. So what's interesting is that both Al-Khwarizmi and Fibonacci don't just acknowledge the Indian authorship; they celebrate it in their titles. There's no hiding where they've got these ideas. And what I don't know, and I should look up, and because there must be an answer to this, is at what point they got known as Arabic numbers, which is what I was taught them to be when I went to school. And I suspect it's a fairly recent nomenclature, because both Fibonacci and Al-Khwarizmi are completely clear that these are Indian.
These are Indian.
Yeah.
So, talking about Buddhism, I think 2 prominent characters have to be. One has to be Swangshan. Next is our Wu Zetian, Empress Wu Zetian.
Perfectly pronounced with both. You're the first
Yeah.
interviewer that's correctly
So,
pronounced those two.
so Wu Zetian, I think she is one of that chapter has to be my favorite in the book.
I think probably
And
mine too.
yeah, so I really think she deserves a plot of her book of her own. But both of them did reasonably a good amount of work in popularizing Indian ideas and Buddhism in China.
Very
And
much
it
so.
probably it is the best and the most prominent period for Buddhism in
Correct.
China.
It's the high watermark of Indian influence in China. And what's interesting is that with both China and with Southeast Asia, people take on Indian ideas for very pragmatic reasons. In Southeast Asia, it's because these kings, can now call themselves, we're the friend of Lord Shiva, we're the friend of Lord Vishnu, but also because the Brahmins are bringing the Pallava Granta script from Kanchipuram. There's no literacy in Southeast Asia before this. Suddenly you've got, very first cousin of the writing system here with the curvilinear Southern Brahmi letters. And this helps in administration, this helps in tax gathering, and these guys are very useful to have around. So you hug them close, you marry them to the princesses, and so everyone's a winner. Equally, with Wu, she is using the Indian Buddhist monks who trained at Nalanda, brought into the court by Xuanzang, for very pragmatic reasons. They are providing prophecies that say that she's this great Devi, this prophesied in the Diamond and the Lotus Sutra, and that she's the reincarnation of Maitreya. And she holds power on this basis. And she clears out the Confucians and the Taoists who had been supreme in court. And she makes the Indian and Chinese Buddhists from Nalanda training at the center of the court system. So this, if you like, is the maximum moment of Indian influence in China. And it's a story I think very few in India know.
Also, now coming back to Angkor Wat, it is possibly the biggest Hindu temple, ironically not in India, in Cambodia.
Also, it has to be said, don't tell Mr. Modi this, but attached to the biggest Hindu empire, which is the Khmer Empire. The Khmer Empire stretches throughout the whole of Southeast Asia, Cambodia, Laos, Thailand, and much of Vietnam. And at its peak I'm not 100% sure about this, but I think you could certainly say that area is certainly equal to the size of the largest Hindu empire, whether it's the Marathas or the Guptas.
So even from epics Mahabharata, Ramayana to Hindu gods to that culture, Indian culture had a very deep-rooted influence in Southeast Asia at that time, right?
Very much so. Still, although Indonesia is now Muslim, you still see the Ramayana very prominently. When I was wandering around Prambanan outside Yogyakarta, there was some outlying temples I was visiting, and I heard the sound of gamelans coming from over the compound wall where I was. So being nosy, I poked in to see what was going on, and it was the gatehouse of the palace at Yogyakarta. And there was this Ramayana being practiced for a ceremony the next day, and these dancers were there, they had their gamelans, and so you had the whole Ramayana in this Muslim court, in this court of a sultan. And to us in India, that's a surprising thing. But it shouldn't be, because if you think of the Rajasthan courts, all the Manganyas and the Langas are Muslim. They're the ones singing the songs of Radha and Krishna and so on.
Now we come to the most important question. Why is this influence of ancient India not widely known? Have we not done enough to promote that idea? Or you mentioned colonialism as a reason for
One of the reasons.
yeah, one of the reasons. So the Britishers were possibly trying to undermine Indian culture, Indian civilization. But what do you think is that one reason which
There isn't one reason. There's lots of reasons. So colonialism is one reason. While the early British, like Sir William Jones and my ancestor James Prinsep, were very enamored of Indian culture, later generations like Macaulay were very dismissive. And Macaulay famously wrote that a single shelf of good English books is worth more than the whole native library of Indian Arabia. And the British could hardly claim to be bringing civilization to a country which was already exporting civilization for 3,000 years. So there was this, I think, diminution of Indian ideas, and there was no attempt even to teach, Indian mathematicians like Brahmagupta and Aryabhatta, who were the equal of Pythagoras and Archimedes, if not greater mathematicians. There's the fact that the Chinese have been very good about telling their version of events. The Silk Road has had a lot of mileage in all countries, including this one. You find Indian scholars talking about the Silk Road that I don't think it existed in the classical period at all. I think also just that the Indian stories got separated into different silos, into different compartments. So the story of Sanskrit in Southeast Asia is taught in the Sanskrit departments. The story of Buddhism has been kind of annexed to the story of the Silk Road, and it's separated from the story of Buddhism. And the story of Indian mathematics is likewise taught in the science departments or the mathematics departments. So the fact that this is all one thing, which is the diffusion of Indian civilization, has got lost somehow.
even Southeast Asia, Asian countries don't seem very thrilled to acknowledge Indian.
So I think that is partly the fault of the 1930s Indian nationalists who had a narrative of military conquest, which is simply not accurate. Malsi Majumdar envisaged the spread of Indian civilization as being by the sword, and saw Indian masters and Southeast Asian slaves. And obviously, the Southeast Asians were not thrilled by that version of events. And this also turned out simply not to be true. There was no military conquest. There were occasional raids by the Cholas in the 1016 and 1225. But in a sense, the most remarkable bit of this story is that it was done peacefully, that Indian ideas spread right over this entire area by the power of their intellectual weight and sophistication, not through the bayonet or the sword or the spear. So I think Southeast Asians have been pushing against this idea of what, so that Indianization has become a dirty word in university departments in Southeast Asia because it was associated with these inflated claims of the nationalists, of political conquest, which is not accurate. The person who got it right was Tagore. Tagore went to Angkor Wat and he said, everywhere I could see India, but somehow I could not recognize her, which is a very nice summation of the complex relation whereby the Hinduism of Southeast Asia is different from the Hinduism of India. So just to complete that thought, so you get no caste in Southeast Asia. So you get everyone eats pork. You have female women Brahmins officiating in temples. And images of emperors as Lord Vishnu. I mean, that would be blasphemy here. You even get the ashes of Suryavarman, the builder of Angkor Wat, in the central tower of Angkor Wat. Now, you'd never have a Hindu king's ashes inside his temple, in a chhatri outside, but not inside. So in all these ways, it can be very different. And it's not a conquest so much as an incredible influence and the adoption, the conscious adoption of Indian ideas by Southeast Asian people themselves for their own pragmatic reasons.
So you write about how post-independence, even Indian leaders refrained from talking more about Turkish invasion, which completely destroyed our ancient universities. So is that could be a reason why we didn't blow the trumpet about our own influence?
So the story of the end of this is a complicated story because it's not just the Turks and the Islamic invasions. It's also the Mongols, which no one ever talks about here. Every uncle is forwarding WhatsApps about the Turks and Mahmud of Ghazni, but I don't think anyone ever really spends much time talking about Genghis Khan and the Mongols. And what they did was very important too, because they cut off the north from Indian traders. There was a hostile border at the end of they got as far as the north of the Punjab, and then there's a border with the Mongol Empire. And it also meant there were waves of refugees speaking Persian, often highly educated refugees coming into Delhi.
Delhi.
And so Delhi ends up being a Persianate speaking area. And so you get the stories of Saurabh and Rustam, where before you just had Bhim and Arjun and Sugriva and Hanuman and all that. So there is this transformation. And in the 12th century, North India becomes a Persian part of the Persianate world, which is a very different civilization. But to me, it's adds to the, as an outsider, it just adds to the complexity of India. You've got all these different layers. You've got the Sanskrit layer, you've got the Persianate layer, then you've got the British layer on top. And there is a way which you can look at this positively, in that it has resulted in this extraordinary richness of culture in India, which you don't have anywhere else. This enormous and highly sophisticated Sanskrit civilization, a Persian civilization on top of that, with its own wonderful literature and extraordinary buildings, and then this whole English-speaking world, which has enabled Indians to work with great ease all over the world in the modern. So you can look at the historical glass half empty or half full, depending on how you want to view these things. I look at it as definitely 3/4 full.
Okay. So thank you, sir. It was a very entertaining chat.
Thank you.